All right, so a pleasant good afternoon to everybody. As Ross mentioned, I'm a research economist at Scion, and I'm presenting some of the results of our project on evaluating the acceptability of biosecurity response tools based on a survey of New Zealanders. So yeah, so New Zealand has almost 15,000 unwanted plant, animal, and marine pests and diseases. And these pests, damage the economy by reducing our crop productivity and increase, production costs. They also damage our environment by feeding on native plants and animals. And they destroy our way of life by, destroying the wilderness and also recreation areas and seek shelter in our homes. And that's the reason why we have these biosecurity tools that have been developed to control these pests. But the big question is, there are different tools. We would like to know how acceptable are these tools, and that's the reason why we have done this research. So the motivation and objective of the work is to look at, the things that make biosecurity more acceptable. So by looking at our effective biosecurity is a willing public. And there was also a study done by Jeter and Payne back in 2004, and this was done in the US, and they found that urban residents would be willing to financially support a program to control an urban forest insect pests. But that research actually misses some context. It didn't look at how tools are used and what technologies given the fact that we're now 2021, we have new technologies. We need to somewhat update the previous study, and then we're focusing on the acceptability here instead of willingness to pay. So, and also the next one is the wrong tools in the wrong place can anger communities and undermine social license. And that's the reason why we're looking at, these different locations, whether it's a farm or a residential area or exotic forests or a native forest. And so these locations can have an impact on, on what type of biosecurity tools are we using, or, and then these specs can also have, high economic impacts or high human impacts, and we're also including that in this study. And so knowing which tools are acceptable in which context would help response agencies make better decisions and prioritize engagement. Okay, so there are many biosecurity tools out there, but for to keep our questions simple in the questionnaire, we focus on 5 tools in the context of an insect pest incursion response. So these tools includes broad aerial spraying, by aircraft, airplane, or helicopter, and then targeted aerial spraying, using drones, and then targeted ground. So you can see this person using a backpack sprayer, and then introduction of sterile insects, and then removal of infested vegetation. And we also included, the option do nothing in the choice experiment. So we've conducted a nationwide online survey, and we got about 1,955 individuals who participated, and then 1,333 gave us, valid choice responses. And we recruited respondents using, social media with a price draw incentive. And we have questions on the direct measures and also questions on choice experiment. So in terms of analysis, so we have used the choice model with a rank order as a dependent variable, because we're after the ranking of acceptability of the different tools. And then to analyze the choice data, we use the panel ordered logit models with interactions of the different attributes. And then we also use the panel ordered latent class logit model, which I think many of you are familiar with. This is an example of our question on the direct measures of acceptability. So in this case, we're looking at targeted aerial spraying. So using drones or unmanned aerial vehicles to spray insecticide onto specific plants. Then we ask the question, how acceptable is it for biosecurity officers to use targeted aerial spraying for eliminating a new pest insect? So ranging from 1 being totally unacceptable, and then to as high as 7 totally acceptable. And the next question is, in general, how effective do you believe targeted aerial spraying is for eliminating a new pest insect? So again, this one we have 1 being highly ineffective and 7 being highly effective. And we also gave respondents, the option don't know if they're unsure of their answer. Okay, so these are the some of the results. So just looking, individually at these different, biosecurity tools, we find here that the removal of infested plants is the most acceptable, and closely followed by sterile insects, and then targeted ground, and then targeted aerial. It's somewhat acceptable. And then when we go down to broad aerial, it falls to the left, which is to the left side of neutral. So meaning that on average, broad aerial is not acceptable by our respondents. Okay, looking at the histograms, you can see here that the removal of infested plants, sterile insects, and also targeted ground, they seem to share, the same type of distribution, leaning more towards the acceptability zone. But when it comes to targeted aerial spray, so it becomes more heterogeneous. So some actually don't want, to get this targeted aerial spray, and then broad aerial spray, you have even a higher proportion, finding it very unacceptable to use as a biosecurity tool. And then we look at the acceptability rating by landscape. So we considered exotic forests, farm conservation in green, native Tonga species in violet, and then residential as in yellow. So you can see that in terms of removal of infested plants, it's highly acceptable in exotic forests. And then when we go down to native species, it somewhat the acceptability is a bit lower compared to the other land areas. In terms of sterile insects, the acceptability is quite similar across the different biosecurity tools. And then when we go down to broad aerial to the right, you can see that, you know, uh, of these four different, landscapes, so they're below the neutral, but exotic forests, they're still okay, somewhat acceptable. Okay, so everybody can hear me okay so far?
Yes, thank you.
Yes, perfect. So now we talk about the ordered stated choice ordered experiment that we did. So in this study, we used this a method where we give each respondent a choice situation that asks to rank the different options. So we used the probabilistic ordered logit models to analyze this type of choice data. So we assume that the utility that respondent n derived from alternative J is in choice situation S is equal to the summation of the beta parameter for the kit attribute multiplied by the X matrix X of attribute levels in choice situation S. And then we have an error term that we assume to be extreme value distributed as we use a logit family of models. So we collected, choice data from 1,333 respondents, and whom we provided each with 8 choice situations. So you can see that for our initial choice models, we use the ordered logit model with fixed effects, where we assume that our respondents have the same set of preferences, so they all have the same color blue. And then we use the panel mixed logit model, which uses maximum simulated likelihood to account for the fact that each respondent is different from others, and therefore enabling us to account for individual heterogeneity. So they all have different colors. And then we use the panel latent class logit model, which can also account for the panel nature of the ordered choice data. However, instead of accounting for individual heterogeneity, it has this class assignment algorithm, which enables the grouping of respondents based on observed choices. So from this, each respondent is assigned to a particular latent class. So we have this group latent class 1, this group latent class 2, and then this group latent class 3. Okay, so this is an example of our choice situation. So first we ask, a new insect pest has been found, and then this insect was found in a farmland. So the expert advisors have calculated the expected impacts if this insect becomes widespread, and they believe it will have a low impact. So the elements of the choice task includes location, so whether it's farmland or conservational or exotic forest, and then you have these pest impacts on humans' economy and ecology. And then we have the tools here, and then we have the effectiveness, and then here we can do the ranking. So that's the example of our choice task. And so these are the results. So if we only look at the our base model, which is a fixed effect, so you can see that the targeted ground base is the most acceptable tool. And then if we move on to model 1, when we added effectiveness, it captured a significant amount of the weights for acceptability. So the positively significant coefficient estimates underneath actually indicate that effective tools for pests with high human and economic impacts are acceptable. And then when we go to model 2, more interaction terms were added, and we actually found here that the broad aerial spraying is not acceptable in residential areas, but they are more acceptable in conservation areas and in exotic pine plantations. And then when we look at targeted ground, we can see that they're more acceptable in residential areas and also in conservation areas, but they're not acceptable in exotic pine forests. So this is also similar to targeted aerial areas. Okay, so for targeted aerial spraying. And then if we look at the introduction of sterile insects, it's more acceptable in residential conservation and exotic fine forests than in farming areas, which is our reference. Okay, so for model 3, using the panel ordered logit model with random parameters, we found that the mean of the random parameter for broad aerial remains positive, but with a very high standard deviation. This indicates a very high variation of acceptability across the respondents. To cast light to this variation, we use the panel latent class logit model, which is this one. So using the panel latent class model, we have identified 3 latent classes. First is the do what works, followed by safety first, and followed by do no harm. So do what works is the largest group, accounting for about 62%, and the safety first 23%, and do no harm about 16% of the respondents. And then you have the number of respondents down there. And then do what works, effectiveness is the most important attribute. And also okay, so that's, and then safety first, you can see that targeted ground and removal infested plant, they're the most important tools, and then effectiveness seems to be low, have a lower ranking. And also in terms of the do no harm, it's quite interesting here. So now respondents, this group actually find do nothing as acceptable, while broad aerial is not acceptable, compared to the other groups. So it's quite interesting. So to give you a summary of those results, so heterogeneity across.
Richard.
3 more minutes, Ross. Sorry.
2
more minutes. Okay, so I'm almost finished now. Perfect. So heterogeneity across groups through a probabilistic class assignment model. So do what works, 62%, effectiveness as most important attribute, and then all biosecurity tools are okay, kind of okay, and then do nothing is not acceptable to this particular group. In terms of safety first, safer tools are more important than effectiveness, and then broad aerial has low acceptability, and then status quo or do nothing is totally unacceptable. And then in terms of do no harm, safer tools are more important and then effectiveness, and then broad aerial is totally not acceptable. And so now broad aerial is totally not acceptable for this do no harm group, and then status quo is actually somewhat more acceptable. Okay, so to conclude, we found that targeted and biological tools are the more acceptable biosecurity tools, and human and economic impacts of effective biosecurity tools matter. The type of land use where biosecurity tools are applied significantly influence their acceptability. And findings from this study we find may support the thinking about the trade-offs between the different factors influencing the acceptability of biosecurity tools in different contexts. And the other thing that I'd like to note, before that, is that I would like to say a caveat. Our respondents were recruited through Facebook, and they may not serve as a representative sample of the New Zealand population. However, the range of comments and responses did show a good amount of diversity. And then as a future work, responses to open-ended questions are being analyzed using a thematic approach. And then results from this qualitative analysis will help us interpret better the results that we're getting from the estimates from the choice experiment. So in the qualitative approach, where you can see these different colors, so classifying the different responses into these different themes. So yeah, so it's quite an exciting. So working with Andrea and Simon at Scion to do this thematic analysis. So thank you. That ends my presentation. Any questions?